In a Foreign Town, in a Foreign Land, by Thomas Ligotti. 1. His shadow shall rise to a higher house. In the middle of the night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the dull black drone of the wind outside my window, and the sound of bare branches scraping against the shingles of the roof just above me. Soon my thoughts became fixed upon a town, picturing its various angles and aspects. A remote town near the northern border. Then I remembered that there was a hilltop graveyard that hovered not far beyond the edge of town. I have never told a soul about this graveyard, which, for a time, was a source of great anguish for those who had retreated to the barren landscape of the northern border. It was within the hilltop graveyard, a place that was far more populated than the town over which it hovered, that the body of Ascrobius had been buried. Known throughout the town as a recluse who possessed an intensely contemplative nature, Ascrobius had suffered from a disease that left much of his body in a grossly deformed condition. Nevertheless, despite the distinguishing qualities of his severe deformity and his intensely contemplative nature, the death of Ascrobius was an event that passed almost entirely unnoticed. All of the notoriety gained by the recluse, all of the comment I attached to his name, occurred sometime after his disease-mangled body had been housed among the others in the hilltop graveyard. At first, there was no specific mention of Ascrobius, but only a kind of twilight talk, dim and pervasive murmurs that persistently revolved around the graveyard outside of town, often touching upon more general topics of a morbid character, including some abstract discourse, as I interpreted it, on the phenomenon of the grave. More and more, whether one moved about the town or remained in some secluded quarter of it, this twilight talk became familiar and even invasive. It emerged from shadowed doorways along narrow streets, from half-opened windows of the highest rooms of the town's old houses, and from the distant corners of labyrinthine and resonant hallways. Everywhere, it seemed, there were voices that had become obsessed to the point of hysteria with a single subject: the missing grave. No one mistook these words to mean a grave that somehow had been violated, its ground dug up and its contents removed, or even a grave whose headstone had absconded, leaving the resident of some particular plot in a state of anonymity. Even I, who was less intimate than many others with the peculiar nuances of the northern border town, understood what was meant by the words "a missing grave" or an absent grave. The hilltop graveyard was so dense with headstones, and its ground so riddled with interments, that such a thing would be astonishingly apparent. Where there once had been a grave like any other, there was now, in the same precious space, only a patch of virgin earth. For a certain period of time, speculation arose concerning the identity of the occupant of the missing grave. Because there existed no systematic record-keeping for any particular instance of burial in the hilltop graveyard, when or where or for whom an interment took place, the discussions over the occupant of the missing grave, or the former occupant, always degenerated into outbursts of the wildest nonsense, or simply faded into a vaporous and sullen confusion. Such a scene was running its course in the cellar of an abandoned building where several of us had gathered one evening. It was on this occasion that a gentleman calling himself Dr. Clatt first suggested Ascropius as the name upon the headstone of the missing grave. He was almost offensively positive in this assertion, as if there were not an abundance of headstones on the hilltop graveyard with erroneous or unreadable names, or none at all. For some time, Clatt had been advertising himself around town as an individual who possessed a distinguished background in some discipline of a vaguely scientific nature. This persona, or imposture, if it was one, would not have been unique in the history of the northern border town. However, when Clatt began to speak of the recent anomaly, not as a missing grave, or even an absent grave, but as an uncreated grave, the others began to listen. Soon enough, it was the name of Ascropius that was mentioned most frequently as the occupant of the missing, now uncreated grave. At the same time, the reputation of Dr. Clatt became closely linked to that of the deceased individual, who was well known for both his grossly deformed body and his intensely contemplative nature. During this period, it seemed that anywhere in town one happened to find oneself, Clatt was there, holding forth on the subject of his relationship to Ascropius, whom he now called his patient. In the cramped back rooms of shops long gone out of business, or some other similarly out-of-the-way locale, a remote street corner, for instance, Clatt spoke of the visits he had made to the high back-street house of Ascropius, and of the attempts he had made to treat the disease from which the recluse had long suffered. In addition, Clatt boasted of insights he had gained into the deeply contemplative personality, whom most of us had never met, let alone conversed with at any great length. While Clatt appeared to enjoy the attention he received from those who had previously dismissed him as just another impostor in the northern border town, and perhaps still considered him as such. I believe he was unaware of the profound suspicion, and even dread, that he inspired, due to what certain persons called his meddling in the affairs of Ascrobius. "Thou shalt not meddle" was an unspoken, though seldom observed, commandment of the town, or so it seemed to me. And Clat's exposure of the formerly obscure existence of Ascrobius, even if the doctor's anecdotes were misleading or totally fabricated, would be regarded as a highly perilous form of meddling by many long-time residents of the town. Nonetheless, nobody turned away whenever Clat began talking about the diseased, contemplative recluse. Nobody tried to silence or even question whatever claims he made concerning Ascrobius. "He was a monster," said the doctor to some of us who were gathered one night in a ruined factory on the outskirts of the town. Clat frequently stigmatized Ascrobius as either a monster or a freak, though these epithets were not intended simply as a reaction to the grotesque physical appearance of the notorious recluse. It was in a strictly metaphysical sense, according to Clat, that Ascrobius should be viewed as most monstrous and freakish, qualities that emerged as a consequence of his intensely contemplative nature. "He had incredible powers available to him," said the doctor. "He might even have cured himself of his diseased physical condition. Who can say? But all of his powers of contemplation, all of those incessant meditations that took place in his high back-street house, were directed toward another purpose altogether." Saying this much, Dr. Clat fell silent in the flickering, makeshift illumination of the ruined factory. It was almost as if he were waiting for one of us to prompt his next words, so that we might serve as accomplices in this extraordinary gossip over his deceased patient, Ascrobius. Eventually, someone did inquire about the contemplative powers and meditations of the recluse, and toward what end they might have been directed. "What Ascrobius sought," the doctor explained, "was not a remedy for his physical disease, not a cure in any usual sense of the word. What he sought was an absolute annulment, not only of his disease, but of his entire existence. On rare occasions he even spoke to me," the doctor said, "about the uncreation of his whole life." After Dr. Clat had spoken these words, there seemed to occur a moment of the most profound stillness in the ruined factory where we were gathered. No doubt everyone had suddenly become possessed, as was I, by a single object of contemplation, the absent grave, which Dr. Clat described as an uncreated grave, within the hilltop graveyard outside of town. "You see what has happened," Dr. Klatt said to us. "He has annulled his diseased and nightmarish existence, leaving us with an uncreated grave on our hands." Nobody who was at the ruin factory that night, nor anyone else in the northern border town, believed that there would not be a price to pay for what had been revealed to us by Dr. Klatt. Now, all of us had become meddling accomplices in those events which came to be euphemistically described as the Ascrobius escapade. Admittedly, the town had always been populated by hysterics of one sort or another. Following the Ascrobius escapade, however, there was a remarkable plague of twilight talk about unnatural repercussions that were either in the making or were already taking place throughout the town. Someone would have to atone for that uncreated existence, or such was the general feeling as it was expressed in various obscure settings and situations. In the dead of night, one could hear the most reverberant screams arising at frequent intervals from every section of town, particularly the back street areas, far more than the usual nocturnal outbursts. And upon subsequent overcast days, the streets were all but deserted. Any talk confronting the specifics of the town's night terrors was either precious or entirely absent. Perhaps I might even say it was as uncreated as Ascrobius himself, or at least for a time. It was inevitably the figure of Dr. Klatt who, late one afternoon, stepped forward from the shadows of an old warehouse to address a small group of persons assembled there. His shape barely visible in the gauzy light that pushed its way through dusty window panes, Klatt announced that he might possess the formula for solving the newfound troubles of the northern border town. While the warehouse gathering was as wary as the rest of us of any further meddling in the matter of Ascrobius, they gave Klatt a hearing in spite of their reservations. Included among this group was a woman known as Mrs. Glim, who operated a lodging house, actually a kind of brothel, that was patronized for the most part by out-of-towners, especially business travelers stopping on their way to some destination across the border. Even though Klatt did not directly address Mrs. Glim, he made it quite clear that he would require an assistant of a very particular type in order to carry out the measures he had in mind for delivering us all from those intangible traumas that had lately afflicted everyone in some manner. "Such an assistant," the doctor emphasized, "should not be anyone who is exceptionally sensitive or intelligent. At the same time," he continued, "this person must have a definite handsomeness of appearance, even a fragile beauty." Further instructions from Dr. Clatt indicated that the requisite assistant should be sent up to the hilltop graveyard that same night, for the doctor fully expected that the clouds, which had choked the sky throughout the day, would linger long into the evening, thus cutting off the moonlight that often shone so harshly on the closely huddled graves. This desire for optimum darkness seemed to be a conspicuous giveaway on the doctor's part. Everyone present at the old warehouse was of course aware that such measures as Clapp proposed were only another instance of meddling by someone who is almost certainly an impostor of the worst sort. But we were already so deeply implicated in the Ascrobius escapade, and so lacking in any solutions of our own, that no one attempted to discourage Mrs. Glim from doing what she could to assist the doctor with his proposed scheme. So the moonless night came and went, and the assistant sent by Mrs. Glim never returned from the hilltop graveyard. Yet nothing in the northern border town seemed to have changed. The chorus of midnight outcries continued, and the twilight talk now began to focus on both the terrors of Ascrobius and the charlatan Dr. Clatt, who was nowhere to be found when a search was conducted throughout every street and structure of the town, excepting, of course, the high back street house of the dreadful recluse. Finally, a small party of the town's least hysterical persons made its way up the hill which led to the graveyard. When they approached the area of the absent grave, it was immediately apparent what measures Clatt had employed, and the fashion in which the assistant sent by Mrs. Glim had been used in order to bring an end to the Ascrobius escapade. The message which those who had gone up to the graveyard carried back to the town was that Clatt was nothing but a common butcher. "Well, perhaps not a common butcher," said Mrs. Glim, who was among the small graveyard party. Then she explained in detail how the body of the doctor's assistant, its skin finely shredded by countless incisions, and its parts numerously dismembered, had been arranged with some calculation on the spot of the absent grave. The raw head and torso were propped up in the ground as if to serve as the headstone for a grave, while the arms and legs were disposed in a way that might be seen to demarcate the rectangular space of a graveyard plot. Someone suggested giving the violated body a proper burial in its own gravesite, but Mrs. Glim, for some reason unknown even to herself, or so she said, persuaded the others that things should be left as they were. And perhaps her intuition in this matter was felicitous, for not many days later there was a complete cessation of all the terrors associated with the Ascrobius escapade, however indefinite or possibly non-existent such occurrences might have been from the start. Only later, by means of the endless murmurs of twilight talk, did it become apparent why Dr. Klatt might have abandoned the town, even though his severe measures seemed to have worked the exact cure which he had promised. Although I cannot say that I witnessed anything myself, others reported signs of a new occupation, not at the site of the grave of Ascrobius, but at the high back-street house where the recluse once spent his intensely contemplative days and nights. There were sometimes lights behind the curtained windows, these observers said, and the passing figure outlined upon those curtains was more outlandishly grotesque than anything they had ever seen while the resident of that house had lived. But no one ever approached the house. Afterward, all speculation about what had come to be known as the resurrection of the uncreated remained in the realm of twilight talk. Yet, as I now lie in my bed, listening to the wind and the scraping of bare branches on the roof just above me, I cannot help remaining wide awake with visions of that deformed spectre of Ascrobius, and pondering upon what unimaginable planes of contemplation it dreams of another act of uncreation, a new and far-reaching effort of great power and more certain permanence. Nor do I welcome the thought that one day someone may notice that a particular house appears to be missing or absent from the place it once occupied along the back street of a town near the northern border.